My name is Arthur, and I am 72 years old. They say that your home is your castle, but for the last 3 years, my castle had become my prison. I lived in a beautiful 5-bedroom house in the heart of the city, a place I built with my own hands and my late wife, Mary. Every brick held a memory, and every room held a ghost of our laughter. But after Mary passed away, the silence became too loud, and my son, Mark, suggested that he and his wife, Sarah, move in to keep me company. At first, it felt like a blessing. I thought my old age would be filled with the voices of my family, but Sarah had other plans. She didn't see a father-in-law. She saw a bank account. She saw a large house that she wanted all to herself, and she saw a man who was standing in the way of her luxury life. It started with small whispers. Sarah would talk to Mark in the kitchen, thinking I couldn't hear her, but my ears are still sharp. She would say, "Mark, your father's getting forgetful. Did you see he left the stove on again?" Even though I hadn't touched the stove all day. She was planting seeds of doubt. She wanted Mark to believe that I was becoming a danger to myself so that they could take control of my estate. I remember the first time she mentioned the words nursing home. We were sitting at dinner, and she placed a colorful brochure on the table right next to my plate. She smiled, but her eyes were cold like a winter morning. "Arthur, we found this lovely place called Silver Oaks," she said. "It has 24-hour medical staff and beautiful gardens. You would be so much safer there." Mark looked at his plate, refusing to meet my eyes. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I told them I was not leaving my home. I told them this was my sanctuary. But Sarah didn't stop. She started gaslighting me, hiding my keys and then accusing me of losing them. She would move my medication and then tell the neighbors that I was losing my mind. I realized then that I wasn't living with family. I was living with enemies who were waiting for me to die or disappear so they could sell my house and move to the suburbs with my money. That night, I sat in the dark and realized I had to fight back. I called my old friend Silas, who had been my lawyer for 40 years. We met in secret at a small park, and I told him everything. I told him that my own blood was trying to trap me in a small room in a nursing home just to steal my property. Silas looked at me with pity and said, "Arthur, you own this house outright. They have no legal power yet unless you give it to them." We made a plan that would change everything. I decided to sell the house secretly to a private investment group. I knew the market was hot and I could get a cash deal in 48 hours. I didn't care about the price. I cared about my freedom. While Sarah was in the living room browsing for new furniture for what she thought would soon be her house, I was in my bedroom signing the final sale papers. The deal was simple. The house was sold, and the new owners would take possession on Friday morning, the same day Sarah had scheduled my evaluation at the nursing home. On Friday morning, I woke up early and packed one small suitcase with my most precious photos and Mary's wedding ring. Sarah came into my room wearing a bright dress, looking like she had already won the lottery. She told me it was time to go to my new home. I sat on the edge of my bed and told her that the car was indeed here, but it wasn't for me. I told her to look out the window. She saw a massive moving truck and a black car with the new owners. She screamed, and Mark ran into the room demanding to know what was happening. I stood up and looked my son in the eye and told him that I had sold the house yesterday. I told him that the money was already moved into a private trust that he would never be able to touch. I told Sarah that since she loved the idea of professional facilities so much, she could go find one for herself because they had 2 hours to leave my property before the police arrived to escort them out. Sarah was hysterical, screaming that I was a senile old man, but Mark just stood there, realizing they had lost everything. They had treated me like a burden, so I treated them like strangers. I watched from the sidewalk as they loaded their expensive cars with their clothes and left my driveway for the last time. I am now sitting in a beautiful apartment by the sea, watching the waves. I have no house to manage and no enemies in the next room. I am 72 years old, and I am finally free from the nursing home trap because I realized that family isn't about blood. It is about respect, and no one will ever lock me away again. And so the days turned into weeks of silence and shadows in my own home. Sarah started inviting her friends over to show them the house as if it was already hers. I would sit in the corner of the living room and hear her pointing at the walls, saying, "We will tear this down and make it an open kitchen, and this old study will be my walk-in closet." They talked about me as if I was a piece of old furniture that was soon to be thrown out. Mark would just nod his head like a puppet on a string. He had forgotten the nights I stayed up with him when he was sick. He had forgotten the sacrifices I made to pay for his college and the way I worked 2 jobs just to make sure he had everything he ever wanted. Sarah had replaced his heart with a stone of greed. I remember one evening she brought me a cup of tea that tasted metallic and strange. I'm not a suspicious man, but the way she watched me drink it with a small smile made my stomach turn. I poured it into the flower pot when she wasn't looking, and within 2 days, the plant had withered and died. She was trying to sedate me, to make me look even more confused in front of the doctors she had called for the mental health assessment. I felt a cold anger rising in my chest. That night, I went into Mary's old sewing room and looked at our wedding photo. I whispered to her that I was sorry for what I was about to do, but I had to protect our legacy. I realized that if I stayed, I would die in a cold room with white walls, surrounded by strangers who didn't care about my name or my life. Sarah had already started packing my books into boxes, labeling them for donation. She didn't even ask me. She just took my life and started folding it away. But while she was busy with her boxes, I was busy with the world outside. I used my old laptop to check the bank accounts and saw that Mark had already tried to withdraw a large sum of money, but he couldn't because the account required my physical signature. He was getting desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. I waited for the perfect moment, which came when they decided to take a weekend trip to a beach resort to celebrate their upcoming move. They left me alone with a microwavable dinner and a pat on the head like a dog. But as soon as their car cleared the driveway, I was on the phone with the estate agents and the auctioneers. I told them I wanted a walk-in, walk-out deal. I told them the house was pristine and the furniture was high-end. Within 6 hours, I had 3 offers on the table from investors who didn't care about the family drama. They just saw a prime piece of real estate. I chose the one that offered the fastest closing time and a cash transfer to an offshore account that my lawyer Silas had set up. I worked through the night, packing only what mattered: my medals from the service, Mary's lace shawls, the hand-carved clock from the hallway. They were so focused on the big prize, the walls and the land, that they didn't even notice the soul of the house was leaking out right under their noses. I felt a strange sense of power every time I walked past Sarah, knowing that her future was built on sand and the tide was coming in, fast. I watched her plan her housewarming party, inviting people she wanted to impress, telling them about the renovation she was going to start next month. I almost felt sorry for her for a split second, but then I remembered the metallic taste in my tea and the dead plant in the pot, and my heart turned back to ice. Justice was not just a word anymore. It was a destination, and I was almost there. The sound of the doorbell was like a crack of thunder in the quiet house. Sarah looked at Mark with a frown and then walked to the door, expecting perhaps a delivery or a neighbor. But when she opened it, she didn't see a friend. She saw 2 men in dark suits holding leather briefcases and a black car with the new owners. She screamed, and Mark ran into the room, demanding to know what was happening. I stood up and looked my son in the eye and told him that I had sold the house yesterday. I told him that the money was already moved into a private trust that he would never be able to touch. I told Sarah that since she loved the idea of professional facilities so much, she could go find one for herself because they had 2 hours to leave my property before the police arrived to escort them out. Sarah was hysterical, screaming that I was a senile old man, but Mark just stood there, realizing they had lost everything. They had treated me like a burden, so I treated them like strangers. I watched from the sidewalk as they loaded their expensive cars with their clothes and left my driveway for the last time. I am now sitting in a beautiful apartment by the sea, watching the waves. I have no house to manage and no enemies in the next room. I am 72 years old, and I am finally free from the nursing home trap because I realized that family isn't about blood, it is about respect, and no one will ever lock me away again. And so the days turned into weeks of silence and shadows in my own home. Sarah started inviting her friends over to show them the house as if it was already hers. I would sit in the corner of the living room and hear her pointing at the wall, saying, "We will tear this down and make it an open kitchen, and this old study will be my walk-in closet." They talked about me as if I was a piece of old furniture that was soon to be thrown out. Mark would just nod his head like a puppet.
The air in the house became thick with a tension that I could feel in my very bones. Sarah was no longer hiding her claws, and the pretense of kindness had completely evaporated. It was a cold Tuesday evening when the trap finally snapped shut. She had prepared a special dinner, and for the first time in weeks, Mark actually sat down and tried to talk to me. But his voice was trembling, and he couldn't look me in the eye. I knew something was wrong the moment Sarah insisted I go down to the basement to find an old bottle of wine she claimed was hidden in the back storage room. I didn't want to go because my knees were aching and the stairs were steep, but she pushed me with a firm hand on my shoulder, saying, "Go on, Arthur, don't be a burden. Just find the bottle so we can celebrate your last night here." I walked down those wooden stairs, each step creaking like a warning. And as soon as my feet hit the cold concrete floor, I heard the heavy wooden door slam shut above me. The sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed through the basement like a gunshot. I ran back up and pulled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I hammered on the wood with my fists, screaming for Mark to open the door, but all I heard was Sarah's muffled laughter from the other side. She told me through the cracks in the wood that this was for my own safety, that I had become too aggressive, and that the doctors would be here in the morning to take me away. Mark was silent. I could hear his breathing, but he didn't say a word. He didn't defend his father. He just let her lock me in the dark like an animal. The basement was cold and damp, and the only light came from a tiny window high up near the ceiling. I sat on an old moth-eaten mattress and felt the weight of my life crashing down on me. For a moment, I felt like giving up. I felt like the old man they wanted me to be. But then I remembered the iron box and the phone I had hidden in my pocket, the one Sarah didn't know about. I had bought a cheap burner phone weeks ago for this very moment. My hands were shaking as I dialed Silas's number and told him that the time had come. I told him they had finally crossed the line and that I was ready to burn the bridge behind me. I spent the night in that cold, dark room, listening to the sounds of them celebrating upstairs. I could hear the clinking of glasses and their muffled voices planning how they would spend the money from the house sale. They were laughing while I was shivering on the floor. But my mind was sharper than ever. I used the flashlight on the phone to look around the basement at the things we had stored over the years. There was Mark's old bicycle, the one I had taught him to ride, and his graduation gown hanging in a plastic bag. It was a graveyard of memories that they had turned into a cell. I realized that I had raised a man who had no soul and a woman who had no heart. As the sun began to peek through the small window, I heard the sound of a heavy vehicle pulling into the driveway. I knew it was the ambulance or the transport team Sarah had hired. I stood up and brushed the dust off my clothes, straightening my back as much as I could. I heard the door unlock, and Sarah stood there with two men in white uniforms. Her face was a mask of fake concern as she told them that I had spent the night in the basement because I was wandering and confused. But when I walked out, I didn't look confused. I looked at her with a clarity that made her flinch. I didn't fight the men. I simply told them that I was ready to go. But before we left, I asked Mark for one last favor. I asked him to hand me the small blue folder on the kitchen counter, the one that had the land deed. He laughed, thinking it was just a piece of paper I wanted to hold on to, and he handed it to me with a smirk. Sarah told the men to take me away, and as they led me to the van, I saw her already on the phone with the real estate agent, telling them the house was officially empty and ready for the sign to be put up. She thought she had won. She thought she had finally gotten rid of the old man. But what she didn't know was that the blue folder contained the final legal notice of eviction that Silas had prepared. The game was over, and she was the one who was about to be homeless in her own dream. The van ride to the evaluation center was quiet, but my heart was drumming a rhythm of cold anticipation. Sarah and Mark followed in their luxury SUV, probably already picking out the colors for the new walls they wanted to build. I was taken into a small white room where 3 doctors sat with clipboards, looking at me with professional pity. They started asking the usual questions. What year is it, Arthur? Who is the president? Do you know where you are? I answered every question with perfect precision and a calm voice that seemed to surprise them. I could see Sarah watching through the small glass window in the door, her face twisted in frustration. She wanted me to fail. She wanted me to stutter and look confused, but I was as sharp as a razor. Then I did something she didn't expect. I pulled out the recording device I had hidden in my pocket, the one that had captured her voice in the kitchen and the sounds of the basement door being bolted. I played it for the doctors and watched their expressions change from professional neutrality to deep concern. I told them about the metallic tea and the dead plant, and I showed them the bruises on my arms from where she had pushed me toward the stairs. The doctors looked at each other and then at the papers Sarah had submitted, accusing me of being a danger to myself. They realized in that moment that the only danger in that house was the woman standing in the hallway. I was declared perfectly sane and fit to manage my own affairs, and as I walked out of that room, Sarah rushed toward me, thinking she had won. She started telling the doctors that I was a master manipulator, but they ignored her and told her that if she didn't step back, they would call the security. I looked at her and said, "Sarah, the house is no longer mine, and it is certainly not yours." She laughed, a shrill and desperate sound, thinking I was finally losing it for real. But then my lawyer, Silas, walked through the double doors with a thick stack of legal documents. He handed her a formal notice and told her that the property had been sold to a historical preservation group as of yesterday morning, and that her right to reside there had been terminated by the new owners. Mark stood there like a ghost, his mouth hanging open as Silas explained that the land deed I held in the blue folder was the original and that it carried a permanent life estate clause for me, meaning I could never be forced out. But since I had sold the entire estate, the new owners were taking immediate possession. Sarah started screaming in the middle of the medical center, causing a scene that made everyone stare. She realized that the luxury furniture and the designer curtains were now the property of a corporation, and that she had exactly 40 minutes to get her personal items before the locks were changed by a professional security team. I didn't wait to hear her threats. I walked out of the building and into the sunshine, feeling like a heavy chain had been lifted from my neck. I drove back to the house one last time, not to stay, but to witness the end of an era. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw the massive sold sign already standing on the lawn. But it wasn't just any sign. It had the logo of a foundation dedicated to preserving old homes. Sarah's dream of a modern mansion was officially dead. I saw her throwing her expensive shoes into the back of her car, while the new security guards watched her with crossed arms. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it could have burned the grass, but I just smiled and tipped my hat. She had tried to trap a lion in a basement, and now she was the one wandering in the wilderness with nowhere to go. Mark tried to come toward me one last time to apologize or perhaps to ask for money, but I just rolled up the window and told my driver to move forward. The boy I loved was gone, and I was no longer responsible for the man he had become. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw them standing on the sidewalk, surrounded by garbage bags filled with their clothes. The house stood tall and proud behind them, no longer their prize, but a monument to the life I had reclaimed. I knew that the next chapter of my life wouldn't be written in a nursing home. It would be written on the decks of cruise ships and in the quiet of my new seaside apartment, where the only sounds would be the waves and the peaceful silence of a man who had finally won his freedom. I watched them in the rearview mirror until they were nothing but tiny dots of failure on the horizon, and for the first time in 3 years I felt like I could breathe without permission. Sarah and Mark had nowhere to go because they had spent every penny of their own savings on down payments for furniture and cars they couldn't afford, expecting my house sale to cover the debt. I heard later from Mrs. Higgins that they had to move into a cramped 2-room motel on the edge of town, where the walls were thin and the carpet smelled of old cigarettes. The irony was not lost on me. Sarah wanted to put me in a small room with white walls, and now she was living in one, without the professional care or the dignity she tried to take from me. Mark and Sarah started blaming each other for the disaster. Their marriage, which was built on the foundation of my wealth, began to crumble under the pressure of poverty. I heard they fought so loudly that the motel manager had to call the police several times. The woman who wanted to be a queen was now a prisoner of her own anger, and the son who chose a